Good afternoon. Welcome to today's SurvivorCircle session. My name is Becky Perkins. I'm the Survivor Support Specialist at Zero Abuse Project, and I'm very glad that you've joined us this afternoon from wherever you are. I'm pleased to welcome again today Dr. Melanie Varney, who will be presenting about understanding and de-escalating from emotional crises. So really good topic. I'm excited to welcome her back again today. Just a few notes about how to participate in today's session. You should be able to see this presentation in a square in the corner of the screen on the Survivor Space website. If you would like to make it larger, it is being live streamed on YouTube, so you can expand the screen and watch it full screen on YouTube if you'd prefer. And also on the Survivor Space page, there is a chat box there. You are able to type in questions or comments directly onto that form, and feel free to do that at any point throughout the presentation today. We will certainly leave plenty of time at the end for questions and discussion about anything, but please feel free to type in anything at any point. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Melanie. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, yes. And if you have comments that you want to chat in or questions, you don't need to wait until the end. You can do them along the way. I won't see them, but Becky will interrupt me and let me know so that, it can be casual. Yes, this is our topic for today. And it's going to be really bare bones. Like, I want to break down in as simple of language and understanding as possible, like what is happening to us when we sort of find ourselves in these heightened emotional states, and then how can we try to self-soothe and bring ourselves down. And so it'll just be, really kind of one-on-one on both, but hopefully something that you can take with you and practice. Another big point of today is to, with some of this information, a major hope is that it's going to normalize what is happening. Something that I've noticed a lot as a therapist and for myself as just like an everyday person as well, is that we have a lot of judgments over when we have heightened emotional states. There's still a lot of stigma around that. And so we'll have some judgments or feelings of shame or guilt around how we express distress. And so some of what I want today to be is to help show that a lot of what's happening is under the surface. So sometimes people will feel like, why am I freaking out over ABC? It's not that big of a deal. But hopefully what we'll break it down today is how, for kind of mind, body, soul, accumulation, things are a big deal more often than they might seem on like a superficial level. So that's what we'll go through today. First, I'll just show everybody, this is our funding acknowledgement for Survivor Space. And the definition that I'm going to use of a crisis is a really kind of basic one. It withholds judgment. I like it for that reason. And so a crisis happens when our stressors outweigh our resources. So you can imagine that there's a lot of different ways that this scale could look. If your resources are really, really high and your stressors are also high, like you actually might be pretty balanced and things will feel pretty stable actually. Or of course, any other variation. And so understanding too that there may be times when it feels like, well, this stressor shouldn't be that triggering or activating for me. But when you think about it in relation to what are your resources, which is kind of what your context is. So resources could be something like your time, money, supportive people in your life. Just kind of what your bandwidth is for a variety of different reasons. And so there are going to be times where that's higher or lower. So that's what I mean by resources, just anything that's kind of contributing to your bandwidth. And then stressors or anything that's going to create stress. And so you can imagine, of course, that if you are a child and you're going through any kind of abuse or violence, that's always, abuse and violence is the highest possible stress you could have. It's the most egregious form of violence. And so as a child, especially, your resources are going to be low. You're completely dependent on adults and other people to like survive and function. Of course, you have some natural resources like natural resilience or maybe creative outlets, maybe some supportive adults, but in general, your resources are low, you're highly dependent. And so that's an example where, of course, your resources and stressors are going to be completely at opposites with each other, but there can also be, other examples like, maybe missing a deadline one week feels like no big deal, but maybe another week at work, you miss a deadline and it kind of throws you into this huge panic attack and spiral. And you may wonder, well, it's the same stressor. Why at one point am I falling into a crisis and another I'm not? And so again, it's keeping in mind that everything is contextual and in relationship to what your resources are at that time. For example, if you simply didn't get a lot of sleep the night before, something like that is very legitimate and really is weighing down what your resources would be. And so something like missing a deadline when you haven't slept well for a couple of nights, like that is a legitimate difference. And so I really want to kind of press in that is legitimate. I think that, again, we have a lot of judgments around what is a legitimate resource, what is a legitimate stressor, and so what is a legitimate crisis, and really wanting to open that up, to remove that judgment and allow it to be legitimate. That having no sleep that night, that is a legitimate hit on your resources. Missing a deadline, that is a legitimate stress. Again, everything being relative to one another and contextual. So that's what we're going to call a crisis. The other thing I'll say about that is, I know that's a really vague term. I'm not breaking it down into understanding a panic attack or understanding a relapse or understanding dissociation. I'm making it a little bit broader than that, just because I think that there are some things in de-escalating that can help across however your crises expresses or presents. So we're all in a crisis, but for one person that might present as dissociating, for another person that might present as anger or aggression, for somebody else that might present as a crying spell, but in general, you're having some sort of internal crisis. And so this is allowing for whatever way you present or express that. So there can be a wide variety. It differs widely from person to person in how they express that type of emotional crisis. And then in this next slide, we're going to really kind of break down actual feeling words when I say emotional crisis. I've found for myself and for clients, it's kind of a theoretical place to come from, that, in general, we don't have a great feeling vocabulary. Part of that is just sort of stigma that is still in our society, that we shouldn't talk about anything negative, much less our feelings, much less like trauma or crisis. Those are just things to kind of put a brave face on and carry on. And so even though a lot of that is progressing and we're becoming more gentle as a society in some ways, that stigma is still there, the threads of it. And so many of us don't have a full vocabulary. And there's a lot of research to show that when we can identify what it is that we're feeling, that can initially be grounding for us. And so one thing that I'll offer is, this is something that you can Google image. There's lots of different versions of it. They all look this type of way with the different layers. But all different versions of it. And I encourage people to keep a screenshot of it on their phone or somewhere that is easily accessible. Because when you find yourself starting to get activated or heightened emotionally in whatever way and for whatever reason, it can be really helpful to go to this feeling wheel and identify what are the particular emotions that are happening right now. And sometimes we don't naturally recall that word on our own, again, because we're not typically throwing out like very specific feeling-based words on like a daily basis. And so that recall may not be there. So if you have something where you can identify it instead of having to recall it yourself, that can be helpful. And just kind of take note, again, there's no judgments, but kind of take note when you are getting heightened, are there certain clusters that you tend to lean toward? There tend to be for people, not always, but a lot of the time people tend to lean towards certain ones more than others. So for example, for myself, I would say that like certain ones like being worried, inadequate, inferior, rejected, like left out, those are a little bit more triggering for me. Like they tie in some to my childhood stuff. And so they'll lend me a little bit more. If I'm feeling a little bit heightened emotionally, they'll kind of escalate that a little bit more. Whereas there are other emotions that don't really escalate that for me as much. Like, for example, if I'm feeling like angry or mad, if I'm feeling hurt or depressed, like those don't quite escalate me as quickly as these other ones. And again, mine tie into some of my childhood stuff. And so I think it's nice for people to know if they do have certain clusters, it's good to know what those are so that you can understand what's happening to you, that those are just more tender areas. And so you can not be so surprised or caught off guard if like, okay, why am I getting upset over this deadline? But if somehow that deadline threads into some of these particular emotions, like the context of it for that reason does, it can give you a little bit of better understanding. Oh, okay, this is why I'm getting so upset. It's maybe falling under my cluster. And then you might just kind of ask yourself, well, are these cluster of emotions maybe something that I had felt or a way that I had experienced from some previous trauma or abuse, or it could just be childhood adverse stress as well. But yeah, just kind of having a little bit of an understanding of this feeling wheel, I think is just a nice place to begin and gain some insight under why you might be experiencing, more heightened emotional states at certain times than others, and just a nice little self-awareness exercise. So yeah, that's what I have to say about that. Other thing I'll say is, in general, if you don't know the HALT acronym, HALT, it stands for hungry, angry, lonely, tired. In general, for all people, those four emotions, I don't know if hunger is considered an emotion, but those four states are heightening for everybody. And so if you're already at like a 4 or a 5 in maybe activation level, if you're also hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, those are always going to exponentially escalate that. So those are ones to just always be aware of, and just trying to have a nice baseline around those four in particular. But then those are kind of more universal for people to be aware of. But then there's always kind of some person-specific unique clusters as well. Yeah, so that's what I'll say about just emotions in general. So basically, a crisis is when your stressors outweigh your resources. When that happens, we are going to feel distressed and we're going to express ourselves in a whole variety of ways. We may be more likely to find ourselves in that state with certain clusters of emotions than others that different situations can bring up. And then now we're going to talk about what actually is happening in your brain during that time. This is also very kind of bare bones way to describe it. But we have 3 different parts of our brain. So the first one is just doing our basic bodily functions. The second one is kind of looking out like for fight, flight, or freeze. It's the one that's sort of observing and kind of taking in information and assessing for what is happening situationally. Third one is a little bit higher order. It allows us to like make a decision that, involves maybe a lot of problem solving or thinking through different options, higher order emotions like empathy, reflection. So this is a really kind of crude way of explaining 3 parts of the brain. So you're always going to maintain your reptilian brain. You don't want that one all on its own. You can imagine a reptile. It's just missing some of those other higher order pieces that you would want. But we always maintain that one. That's kind of, our most basic functioning. And then for the limbic system, that one can, we all have it, but for those of us who've experienced trauma, it sort of messes a little bit with the sensitivity level of that. And so it can make it harder for your brain to kind of accurately perceive what is a threat and what is not. And so sometimes if you've been in kind of a traumatic, abusive, or pervasively stressful situation, then it sort of puts our nervous system on a little bit of high alert. And so it can be more difficult to decipher whether something is actually in danger or not. And so you might find yourself jumping a little bit more before you realize that something might be okay. And so that takes a lot of labor. That's a lot of emotional, physical, mental labor to always be kind of looking to assess whether something is of danger or not, and the time it may take to realize if it is or isn't. And so there's a fatigue and an exhaustion that can come with that. And then the rational brain, if we're in a crisis, chances are that part is just gone. It's what contributes to tunnel vision if you're in a crisis. I remember one time I had to make a phone call. There was like a car accident, and I had to just like call the police and say, hey, there's a car accident, so I need to come. And I remember they asked me like, what street are you on? And I live in this town. I know what street I'm on. It's a normal street I'm on all the time. I could not for the life of me think of what street we were on. I literally ran, I don't know how far, to see the actual sign to like remember and recall. So when we're in crisis, that third part of us is not accessible. And so we're really working with the first two. Another example that I give sometimes for the limbic system is that if you were to, the limbic system and a little bit of the rational brain, but if you were to come home and see like a garden hose and you think it's a snake, at first you would kind of jump, you would maybe detect some danger, and you would kind of have like a fight, flight, or freeze response. But then as soon as you realize, oh my gosh, it's just the garden hose, you would kind of relax in, and then you would be able to recover and feel fine. But that process becomes much more stressful and elongated and not as clear, depending on like how much stress we've been managing and looking out for. Yep. And so again, this is all to legitimize. I've seen people sometimes feel really frustrated with maybe how their emotional state has presented. But again, trying to remind you that you're working with different parts of the brain, which is appropriate. Like when you're in a crisis, that third part isn't accessible. And so we'll talk about some things to try to de-escalate, so that you can start to feel like you have a little bit more working on your side, to come out of that, make decisions again, feel a bit more like yourself again, when you're not normally in that state. So yeah, we'll talk about some strategies for de-escalating. So again, regardless of type of way that your emotional type of crisis presents, these are a few things that are like highly researched and supported. We're going to go through and do examples of each one. And what I'll say is I like to start with these because they are so well supported. They are so effective. And if you're somebody who's maybe been to a lot of therapy before and you're like, oh, another therapist telling me to do these same things, know that like if these don't resonate with you, there are many other types. So we'll also talk in my next slide about some more like person-specific options. But I'll start with universally. I mean, what we know is helpful, but for some people, just personality and just preference, it's perfectly okay if some of these don't speak to you. That does not mean that you're not able to de-escalate yourself. It just means that, yeah, you need something else that's maybe a little bit more specific to your personality or preference, that'll work for you. So I'm going to go through these. We'll talk about them, but yeah, that's my disclaimer to start. So breathing techniques are really important because they're bringing oxygen back into your brain. They're releasing CO2, and it's just going to help kind of regulate crisis. When we're feeling worked up, we take really shallow breaths, and that can just create more like racing heartbeat, racing thoughts, difficult. That third part of the brain is having a hard time coming back, things like that. So we're going to talk about some specific types of breathing. There's millions of types of breathing for all different types of benefits. So these are just a couple. So if you think you like the breathing techniques, but you're not into these three, or you want to try other ones, there's so many. Box breathing is a really simple where you're going to breathe in for 4, or you can pick the number of counts that feels good for you. It could be 3, 5, whatever count feels good. 4 tends to be like a nice middle number. So breathing in for 4, hold for 4, exhale, hold, inhale. So I guess, I don't know if this is why it's called box breathing, but it's sort of like equal parts. So let's go ahead and do one together. I'm going to do it with you. The preference is to breathe in and out through your nose if you can, if that's available to you. If not, mouth is fine, but yeah, nose is first preference. So go ahead, and we're going to breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4, hold. And then exhale for 1, 2, 3, 4, hold. And then inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it takes a little bit of concentration, but not too much. So you're just going to be counting basically equal 4 breaths in and out, holding in between. So that one's really nice. The other one is diaphragmatic belly breathing. And all that really is making sure that you're not just breathing in your chest. You're not just breathing from your throat to here, that when you're breathing, you're bringing it all the way in through your belly and diaphragm. So what you're going to want to do, you can put your hands on your belly if that helps you to just kind of feel it. So first thing you'll do is let your belly hang out. We kind of like naturally suck and hold our bellies in throughout the day. So if you find that you're doing that, first step is you're going to go ahead and let your belly hang out and put your hands on it if that's helpful. And when you breathe in, your stomach is going to push out. A lot of the time when we breathe, we do the opposite. We breathe in and our stomach comes in. We're going to try to do the opposite of that, which is really our more natural way of breathing. So we're going to breathe in, and your belly should kind of push out. And then when you exhale, your belly should fall back in. So that rising and falling is going to be really good for you to make sure that you are breathing all the way down into your belly and your diaphragm, and you're doing full deep breaths in and out. And so hands on the stomach can be helpful. And yeah, so that's just kind of checking in that you're actually breathing in and exhaling in like the fullest available way. Alternate nostril breathing. I actually was reading a book after I had already done this first presentation, and it talked about this in a way that I hadn't seen before. So I'm actually going to quickly read it to you. And then we'll do it together. Okay. So the right and left nasal cavities, they work like an air conditioning control system, and they're kind of controlling the temperature, blood pressure, and feeding the brain chemicals to alter our mood, emotions, and sleep states. So there's research to show that the right nostril works like a gas pedal. When you're inhaling primarily through your right nostril, circulation speeds up, your body gets hotter, your cortisol levels, blood pressure, and heart rate all increase. This happens because breathing through the right side of the nose activates the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight mechanism, and puts the body in a more elevated state of alertness, readiness. So breathing through the right nostril will help you to feel more blood to the opposite hemisphere of the brain, specifically prefrontal cortex, which has been associated with logical decisions, language, and computing. So that's the right nostril. Left nostril is the opposite effect. So it's more like a brake system. to the accelerator of the right nose. So the left nostril is more deeply connected to the parasympathetic nervous system. You don't have to know all of that, but the rest and relax side. So that's going to lower your body temperature, lower your blood pressure, cool off your body, reduce anxiety. And so we're going to do something. I'll give you this little stat. It's nice. In 2015, researchers were recording the breathing patterns of a schizophrenic patient over the course of 3 years, found that she had significantly greater left nostril dominance. So this breathing habit, they hypothesized, was overstimulating the right side of the brain, which is the creative part. So over several sessions, they taught her to breathe through the opposite nostril, the logical one, and she experienced far fewer hallucinations from doing that. And so part of what they're posing and what yoga and kind of other modalities like that are saying is that we can create a sense of internal balance truly through our brains and nervous system through kind of practicing different types of breathing. So you can do just left or right. We're going to talk about alternate nostril breathing. That's what I'm going to go through. But yeah, you can kind of favor one or the other depending on maybe what you feel like you're needing. So for alternate nostril, take your 2 fingers and you can use any 2. These are common. You're going to breathe in through one, plug up the one you breathed in from, breathe out the opposite. Now you're going to breathe in that same one, plug, out the other. And you're just going to repeat that as often as you need. Again, you don't have to alternate. You can favor one or the other based on some of this research, but alternate nostril breathing is really nice. Takes a little bit of focus. It's going to help slow you down, and it's going to create a little bit more balance. And then for the 5 senses, these are a form of grounding that you can use while you're doing a breathing exercise, or you can do them separately. So it's just identifying things in your natural state of where you are right now to help ground you and bring you back into your body. When we go into an emotional crisis, we sort of leave our body in different ways. And so this is going to help kind of bring you back down. So for example, even for me right now, for sound, I could be focusing on like the clicking of the fan above me, touch, what it feels like to be sitting in my chair, my arms on my desk, sight, obviously everything in the room and what I'm looking at, smell, I don't have too much smell going on. Yeah, and so I'd probably just take in a really natural sense of, what my house tends to smell like. Sound, I don't know if I did sound. Smell, taste. Yep. Even if you have nothing in your mouth will just have a taste from like the day or whatever you ate or drank, or just your natural kind of even state. So you can always tap into that without accessing anything extra. So these 5 senses are really nice because they can be really discreet. So if you're in a place where it's difficult for you to maybe do alternate nostril breathing or something like that, this can be a little bit more discreet. You can do it anywhere. If you have the ability or availability to be more intentional with it, you can do that as well. So you could purposefully play a really loud favorite song that you had to kind of get in touch with that sense. You could put a really sweet or sour candy in your mouth to get in touch with that sense. So you can be as intentional or whatever is in front of you as possible. To sort of practice noticing, being present is really what's helping you get back in your body. And so our senses are going to help us to do that. So that's a second one. And then the last kind of very commonly supported, discussed strategy is progressive muscle relaxation. We often don't realize that probably leading up to an emotional crisis or feeling a little bit activated, our body is probably starting to respond beforehand. Maybe our shoulders are getting tighter, maybe our jaw is getting clenched, maybe our neck is starting to feel tight. So we tend to kind of start to tense our body up. And so part of a way to de-escalate is to allow our body to progressively relax and loosen. And one way to do that is you can initially just go ahead and try to let everything soften, but oftentimes we don't realize where things are hard. So what you would do is you'd actually pick different parts of your body and harden them on purpose. So you might take your hands and make a really, really tight fist and then loosen it so that you can feel the difference. You can become aware. You might clench your jaw and then loosen it. Curl your toes, loosen it. Squeeze your hamstrings or your thighs together and then loosen it. So that's another strategy that's going to help your body kind of release. And with that, you'll be able to kind of get a little bit back in your body and a little bit more grounded. I'm going to leave it at those for today just because of where I'm at with time. But if in the questions it comes up, I may talk about these other strategies that I like to use too, that are kind of person specific. But I think for now, I'll leave it at that. This is sort of a mentality that I have. Sometimes people will very fairly feel like, okay, if I'm going through a lot of violence or trauma or PTSD, like how is breathing or how is being in my body or how is, squeezing my fist and letting go, like how is that going to help me? And that's a really legitimate question. These are not enough on their own, of course, for like the magnitude of what people may be like working through. So the mentality is not that these kind of superficial things on their own will help, but that they're sort of in the spirit of a really radical kind of form of liberation, and that is to take care of ourselves. There's a lot in our society that the momentum pushes us actually from laboring and belaboring and kind of causing harm to ourselves. And so a lot of this is really counterculture and radical in that way, that actually to take time to just breathe as like a lifestyle or as like an overall mentality is more than what it may appear on the surface. And so that's just a few of my favorite quotes. And then I will see what questions or comments people may want to discuss. And if there are none, I can go back to that other slide, but in case there are, I want to make sure that I left time.
Great, thank you, Melanie. We have one question. I take care of my mom who gets angry easily, probably because she has mobility issues, but she was also abused when she was a child. Like a lot of the older generation, she probably would not believe in many of these techniques. Are there any ideas on how to help her feel more calm and in control?
This is, of course, a hard question because it's very like person specific, relationship specific, contextual specific. But it's not uncommon that maybe some things that could be helpful are not. That's why I just say like they're not accessible or they're not available. And that could just be a mindset. Like, for example, for me, like quiet meditation, like non-guided is wonderful, but for me, it's just not accessible. Like it's more accessible. It's more available for me for things to have music or like be guided. And that's just, there's nothing wrong with that. I have to access it a different way. So I would just like offer some normalization for your mom that like, because of whatever time, place, context, certain things don't feel and genuinely maybe aren't ever going to be accessible or available to her. And that we all have that in different ways. And for her, it may be, in whatever ways you observe. So I would actually recommend that you try and use these for yourself. I mean, the levels of burnout and stress on caretakers of any type are really, really high. This is sort of the long game, which, may or may not be relatable. But if you're sort of taking care of yourself, people tend to, and again, I can't speak for specific people, but people tend to notice like they seem calm, they seem to have good boundaries, they seem to be taking care of themselves. And so sometimes it becomes like people become more curious or open-minded when other people are just doing it. And not telling them to do it, but they're just sort of modeling it. So there may be some opportunities for you to do it for yourself, which may inadvertently become some modeling. And so that could be one way where either way you're taking care of yourself and potentially could model for somebody else as well. Yeah, but otherwise, it sounds like with those where it's less accessible, there's just tends to be more person-specific, relationship-specific creativity. Maybe breathing isn't the way in, but music, aromatherapy, things like that are really good for stress management. Maybe you find that there's some other more accessible ways in to kind of create a little bit more soothing music, maybe like lavender scent, so it may just create some, but that would be on you, to do those things. So maybe just different ways in. Yeah, sorry, it's a hard question, but I wanted to try to give you something. So yeah, don't be shy if you have a follow-up.
And that person says thank you, and I can somewhat relate. My mom passed away last year, and she was immobile for quite some time before she passed, and she was naturally kind of feisty anyway. So it was hard for her to navigate that, that kind of loss of control. So kind of like you were saying, Melanie, it's, I had to kind of prioritize taking care of me. And I think at times that even me just modeling taking care of me was helpful to her, kind of gave her permission to sort of, do that for herself. But I know everyone's different, of course. There was another question. Is exercise helpful for de-escalation?
Yes. I don't think of it as yes. So one of my slides is the idea that there's a disclaimer, just to be clear, there's no one thing that is good or isn't good. In general, breathing is highly supported. In general, moving your body, anything with your body is going to be really good. Stretching, yoga, maybe whatever type of exercising you like, maybe jogging. Like in general, movement-based things are going to help us come back into our body. They're going to help us kind of rebalance some things. The only disclaimer in that is you also have to maybe sit down with yourself and just kind of check in on your relationship with any of these things. So, for example, there are people who maybe do meditations every day, silent breathing, meditations. But rather than becoming a resource, something that helps them to kind of de-escalate or stay more balanced, it becomes a little bit more of an addiction. Like I sort of have to do this to feel okay. And so anything can go in that direction. So something that we all know is like healthy for our bodies in general, like exercise, it can always move in that way. So that's why when I get a question of like, is exercise good? It's always like, oh my gosh, yes, of course. And I also want to include the caveat or the disclaimer that everything is about what our relationship is to it. So you can have a really healthy relationship with wine and it can be a good resource for you. That one probably is more commonly not as much, but just to show that it can really be anything in any direction. And you could have a really difficult relationship with exercise or meditation or breathing. So that's my only disclaimer. But yes, in general, movement-based things are going to help a lot. Like dance, there's a lot of like talk around the actual chicken dance, if you know that dance. When you're getting escalated, you maybe would need some privacy for that, depending on your personality. But yeah, in general, moving your body and exercising would be a good option as well.
That's great. Thank you. I never thought of the chicken dance as being helpful,
I know
but
it's
it kind of goes along with what you were saying about like tensing your muscles and then kind of relaxing them. It does have those elements.
sure, and it's just a little silly, so it kind of
Yeah.
snaps us out of it. You're using your whole body. It's not too strenuous, but you're moving. It's a little silly. It's not a movement you typically do. So you are acknowledging to yourself that this is a different reason to move. So sometimes we move to exercise, and other times we move for fun, or we move to calm down. We don't tend to do the chicken dance regularly. So your body and mind will recognize that you're doing a different type of movement. So it's signaling you're trying to get a different type of, a specific type of result. So yeah, do the chicken dance. But again, some people that's more accessible than others. Yeah.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Don't have any other questions, but we'll give folks a couple minutes. Are there any things that you can? This is just a question I have. Are there any things that you can do to kind of be more in tune with yourself to kind of notice when an emotional crisis is coming before it's actually sort of taking over how you feel?
Yeah, we typically escalate at an incline. For some people, depending on the person or situation, we escalate at like a really even, like 0, 1, 2, 3. And we kind of, it's kind of gradual. Other times for people, it's 0 to 1 to 2, and then as soon as they're at 2, right after 2 is 10. So people have different types of incline that happens. Of course, the hope is always that as you recognize the symptoms of the incline sooner, that you can de-escalate sooner or plateau sooner, because it's easier to move from a distress level 2 to 1 than it is to move from 5 to 1. So some of the best ways to kind of notice what are yours, everyone's is a little bit different. So for some people, like when they're at a 1, they're just a little irritable. It's not a big deal. It's not super noticeable, but they notice they just feel a little bit more irritable or negative at like a 1, but it's not super noticeable. Maybe by like a 2 or a 3, they realize they're kind of not sleeping great, but they kind of can carry about their day. Maybe by like a 4 or 5, they notice that they start to have a little bit like racing heartbeat, a little bit racing thoughts, but again, it's not too bad. By a level 6, 7, they're crying, they feel a lot of neck pain, so it can differ from person to person about what that looks like. So I do encourage like journaling, like what you're feeling like when, and you can rate it for yourself. Like, what do I feel like today? Like, yeah, I'm a little bit irritable, but on a 1 to 10, I'm feeling like a 2, like I can carry on. And so you can just kind of, there's just sort of some tracking. And you're wanting to track both your emotional states. You can use the feeling wheel for that. You're also wanting to track your body symptoms, like physical pain, sleep, loss of appetite, more appetite. So physical symptoms. You want to track your emotional symptoms. What emotions are you having? And you also can track like relational things. So for some people, when they're at like a 6 or 7, they start withdrawing, or they start getting in fights with friends, or they start going back to old people pleasing that they totally thought they let go of, but when they're at a 7 or an 8, they kind of freak out and just have to go back to people pleasing or whatever it may be. So those are the 3 categories that are really good to track. And then you can kind of see like, what do I think, what level am I at when those are happening? So that kind of comes over time for you to see what are your trends of how you present, and that'll change over the course of your life as well. But those are like the 3 categories I think are good to track and notice. I do think that you'll find some trends in how you tend to show up at different levels. And that might help give you clues along the way that, okay, I'm getting to the place where I'm not sleeping through the night. I'm not quite, waking up crying yet, but I'm not sleeping well and I'm feeling really irritable. So I'm probably at this level. So, what are some of the resources that I need to start doing now to help tip that scale, help get the resources back up? Because once that's happening, I'm aware that my scale is starting to go like this for stressors because my body's telling me it is. I hope I answered.
Yeah. And someone commented, yes, sleep is so important. If I don't get enough sleep, I can definitely tell.
Yes.
And I do think that's true. And I think sleep is one of the biggest things that gets sacrificed, of all of our health habits. That's the first one to get neglected, it feels like, but it's so important.
Yes. Sleep is huge. It's become really normal to not sleep, like societally, but yes, sleep is huge. And if you know that for yourself, that's part of how you're practicing that radical form of taking care of yourself is like, yeah, I can't work a job that's 80 hours a week because I need to be sleeping. Or I can't like watch your cat this weekend because I had a lot to do at work and I have to be keeping track of my sleep. And I think, again, we can sometimes live in a society where we can feel like that's silly or someone would make fun of us for that or that's not legitimate. But like, it's very much like scientifically like legitimate that like needing to sleep is a good reason to like have to say no to something, especially if you'd maybe had a couple nights not. So sleep and diet are some really kind of tried and true important ones.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, I know we've come to the end of our time for today, but we will leave the chat box open for a while on the page. So if anyone has additional questions or would like to continue the conversation, please feel free to do that. You can type directly in there. If you have a question specifically for Melanie, I will be happy to pass that along to her. But thank you to everyone who joined us today. We will be offering more of these sessions in July. We're planning those out, so please check back on the SurvivorCircle's page for our updated schedule. We'll have that up soon. So thank you all so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.